Morning, everybody, on this very snowy late February day. I'm glad that everyone could join us, and it is the marvel of our teleworking that makes this all possible, of course. This morning we have Paul Gardner with us, who's going to be talking about the future of the Clean Water Fund and funding recommendations for FY 24 and 25. Paul is the administrator of the Clean Water Council, and he's an employee of the MPCA and the Commissioner's Office. He worked in the recycling and solid waste field, which I did not know, for 20 years and served as a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives from 2007 to 2010. He has a BA from Grinnell College in history with a concentration in Russian and East European studies. Fascinating, Paul, and an MPA from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. One thing I did not realize is that he writes in his abstract, his summary for the talk, that the Clean Water Fund will bring in around $3 billion to the state's water quality and drinking water source protection efforts by 2034. And today he's going to talk about the latest proposals, as I mentioned, for 24 and 25 and show its change since the ratification of the Legacy Amendment and other things. Paul, it is great to have you with us this morning. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Mark extended this invitation when I convened a panel discussion about the Clean Water Fund at the Water Resources Conference in October. And I thought it went well. We had 3 panelists, but he seemed to think it was great. So he said, let's get you on the calendar. And I said, okay. As you can tell from my bio, I lack basic scientific credentials. I am a liberal arts person, to be sure, but that can come in handy, actually, when I work among scientists and also interact with policymakers. I've ended up being an interpreter of sorts. So today I'd like to share where we've been going with the Minnesota Clean Water Council, where we've been with work that so many of you have been doing, and where we're going in fiscal 24 and 25. See, and I love this seminar series, by the way, because since I lack these scientific credentials, it has been nice to listen to people who actually know what they're talking about in water, and I have tried to absorb it all, and it does come in quite handy to train all of us in different fields. I have found that since there's so many new people at the PCA in the last, that many people aren't familiar with the Clean Water Council or the Clean Water Fund. So I tend to get a little bit more basic here and let you know that the Minnesota Clean Water Council is a state advisory council. It was created in 2006 to advise on the implementation and administration, love that bureaucratic language, of the Clean Water Legacy Act. The Clean Water Legacy Act was set up in 2006 to get at the issue of addressing impairments in our water, or waters that go beyond water quality standards, as well as protect groundwater and drinking water sources. And so a council was created by statute to help advise on that. Unfortunately, the Clean Water Legacy Act didn't come with any money during divided government at that time. And so in 2008, the voters ratified by a substantial margin the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, which supports parks and trails, arts and cultural heritage, habitat, and clean water. I was honored to have been in the Minnesota House at that time in 2008 to put that on the ballot. I didn't realize that I'd be working on the other side of it years later. The Clean Water Council itself is made up of 17 voting members from constituencies listed in statute that you see on the right. And then we're also represented with non-voting members by 6 agencies, including the MPCA, where we're ably served by Glenn Skuda. We also have the University of Minnesota and 4 legislators, 1 from each caucus in each house. And Mark, if anyone has any clarifying questions or audio issues, just give me the signal. So when I was at that Water Resources Conference for the university at River Center in October, I was sitting with people who are younger than me. I'm in my 50s. And they said, oh, I didn't know the Clean Water Fund expired. or they didn't know how long it lasts. So I just want to make sure it's clear that the constitutional amendment passed by the voters in 2008, it lasts for 25 years. And by the time it expires in June 2034, we'll spend about $3 billion more or less, depending on how inflation goes. And it's fairly specific in the Constitution as to how we can spend that money, which is on protecting, enhancing, and restoring surface waters, protecting groundwater, and protecting drinking water sources. And we must spend, according to the Constitution, at least 5% of the fund only on drinking water sources. I don't mean to freak anybody out, but as of today, the legacy amendment does expire in 11 years, 4 months, and 9 days. I only say that because it is important for us to articulate what we've been doing with the fund to the general public, policymakers, and others, because they keep asking. If saying we're doing good work doesn't really suffice, we need to be able to articulate what outcomes we're going to have by 2034. And so we've been working on that at the council. Just to tell you the mechanics, since the money runs out midnight, June 30th, 2030, if someone were to suggest renewing the amendment or something like it, that would have to be in 2032 on the general election. That's the, you can only pass or ratify a constitutional amendment on an even numbered year. And to put it on there, you need a majority vote by the legislature. And so the legislature that's elected in 2030 will be the ones who decide what goes in the ballot in 2032, which would allow a streamless flow of funding after the expiration of our current amendment. And that election, by the way, is 7 years, 8 months, and 14 days away. So not too far away. I hope everybody's feeling okay now. So there are some more specific allowed uses of the Clean Water Fund in state statute that were passed in 2009, which I think I must have voted for because I was there. And that is to do the things that many of you at the PCA are doing, which is testing our waters, developing our impaired waters list, doing TMDLs, helping develop restoration plans, evaluating, which is really in the realm of monitoring, protection strategies where needed. We do fund some gray infrastructure with wastewater and stormwater grants and loans, and we work on preventing degradation of groundwater. But we have the catch-all category of supporting agencies to do the above, including enhanced compliance and enforcement. We actually do most of the enhanced compliance and enforcement from the Clean Water Fund at the PCA through the MS4 permit and helping folks know how to comply, particularly with our new permit. And then also SSTS. We spend a substantial amount of money supporting counties for their inspection with SSTS, which has been a great success, at least from my perspective. And we're also able to provide low-income grants for SSTS as well. So that's great. I tend to, when I speak to general audiences, try not to talk about our various silos. We do have a tendency in state government to say, well, our agency does this part, and somebody else says, well, our agency does this part, and people don't see how all the pieces fit together. So I tend to de-emphasize the lines of the agencies, and I don't mean to give offense to anybody. I'm just trying to get ideas in people's heads as to what we're doing, and then attribute things to the agencies later. But I do want to mention that we do have 7 agencies at the state government who are doing work with the Clean Water Fund, as well as the University of Minnesota. However, that has caused some policymakers to assume that the only people in the Clean Water Fund are agencies, and that we're somehow padding our cubicles with piles of cash or something like that. And so I have asked around and gotten some statistics. And in fact, we spend about 2/3 of the money from the Clean Water Fund leaves state government through grants, loans, technical assistance, and the like. Again, not to degrade the work we're all doing as public employees, but I do let people know that we're deploying for specific purposes. And more than half of the state FTEs, which some legislators seem to obsess over, happen to be in Greater Minnesota, where more or less that generally means that they are providing direct assistance to communities and landowners, governments. Not always true. There are people doing statewide work who work in Greater Minnesota and vice versa, but you kind of get the idea. So I wanted to completely dumb down all the work we're doing here now. Okay, I'm just kidding. Well, sort of. So I found when I first took the job that many stakeholders out there said, I don't know how you're using the money. Is there some strategy here? It just seems like you have a lot of programs with duplicative words like strategies and protection and restoration and wraps. And it just seems like everyone's doing the same thing. Is there some strategy here, or are we just funding duplicative efforts? And of course, the good news is there is a very significant and cohesive strategy for how we use the dollars. We haven't always articulated it very well, but when I first started, I managed to get it down to a half an hour to explain to people how we use the money, and I found that might have worked for 3 or 4 people, but not for 3 or 400. So the 30-second elevator speech version here is the kind of thing that gets light bulbs to go off, and I go, oh, okay, so there is a plan. Such as we test waters for impairments. That's what monitoring and assessment is. We try to find the source of the problem. If there is something wrong with our water, we come up with a plan to fix the problem. We're protected if there isn't anything wrong and we wanted to maintain high quality waters. Then we fund a fix, and then we measure to see if the fix worked. I heard a presentation recently about continuous improvement models in the corporate sector, and there's a model of plan, go, check, act, which some of you may be familiar with. And this is called the watershed management framework, the water management framework that we use, which is also a circular approach. But I have found that this approach actually has worked out really well. And people go, oh, okay, then tell me more. So then I have them. So I also try to use pictures to help. Some people are better visual learners, which is great. They don't want to listen to a lot of words. And so I use this example, and David Miller at PCA was very helpful in putting this map together for me. This is the Yellow Medicine River watershed in southwestern Minnesota. The Minnesota River flows northwest to southeast in this picture from the Montevideo area down through Granite Falls and Redwood Falls. This is a heavily cultivated area. Something like a quarter to a half of this watershed is drain tiled. Drainage is par for the course in an area that's very fertile. The Buffalo Ridge stretches running from northwest to southeast down at the lower corner there, where you see what looks like a lot of change in topography. The red lines obviously are impaired waters. The red dots are impaired lakes. The dark blue lines are waters that are considered healthy. But these are typical impairments that we see through the monitoring, assessment, and characterization process. With 132 impairments for the reasons you see on the right, pretty typical for an agricultural area. That is not really any surprise. But when I show this to the general public and the policymakers, it helps them because they can see, the big topics here: sediment, nutrient, bacteria. Those are really the big factors, and it explains why we focus on those, because 85% of our impairments are non-point sources. Then I show people that we have a one watershed, one plan. This is the comprehensive watershed management plan. This is just one page, a summary page out of the Root River watershed, rather than Yellow Medicine. But I annotated it for people, and I just said, the idea is here, based on the monitoring, the characterization and assessment, and the RAPs that many of you are working on, we know that if we do a certain number of activities at a certain scale by a certain year, we should get the desired pollutant reductions, which should coincide with our nutrient reduction strategy. And we have an idea of what it would cost to do. This is very empowering information that other states do not have, especially on a statewide basis. That's the good news. The bad news is the cost to fix everything well exceeds what we have available in the Clean Water Fund. And so I always try to convey that to people who appropriate the money, that money alone helps a lot, but it can't fix everything. So, once those comprehensive plans are done, then more money flows to the Clean Water Fund. And the Clean Water Fund pays for the monitoring, the characterization, the assessment. We fund other agencies like the DNR with fish, IBI, groundwater atlases with the DNR, geologic atlases at the county level for the University of Minnesota. So after all that's put together in the RAPS and the comprehensive plan, we actually have money that flows that goes through Bowser to those watersheds. We also have competitive dollars. Those are the blue dots that have been made. Those are projects that have been supported by the Clean Water Fund since the fund was created. But then the green triangles are Clean Water Fund watershed-based implementation funding grants. Did you get all that? I show this map to people to say there is a method to our madness here, because based on the science and not politics, we are concentrating our efforts financially on areas where we can get the biggest impact to address those impairments with products or with work that's done on the right. And Matt Drewitz is now at PCA, put this map together for me. Thank you, Matt. Another reason that I put the years on here is that it can take a decade or more to get from start to finish, from the initial monitoring to the follow-up monitoring that shows that we might even be able to get something off the impaired waters list and have EPA actually delist it, and 10 to 15 years even. So I always mention that to people because I said this is why we have the 25 years of the amendment, because we can manage to do things systematically in 80 major watersheds throughout the entire state. That tends to give people some comfort, which is good. I did want to say something about impairments, though, and I try to avoid showing this map on purpose because it causes usually a freak out. That's why I've annotated here to say insert freak out. When people see this map, they stop paying attention to everything else that you're saying. This is the impaired waters list or impaired waters map with some successes, with some delistings there you see in the purple. But we've always been looking at the Clean Water Council for how to measure success and how we're using the Clean Water Fund. And the first question I asked was, well, aren't impairments the way we measure success, since that is what we're spending so much time working on? And I have discovered that they aren't really. They're an excellent tool for diagnosing problems so that we can fix them. But in terms of measuring success of the fund, it's not a very good indicator. To wit, if you compare us to our peers, like Wisconsin, we actually have 4 times the number of impaired waters as Wisconsin does. But after talking with Glenn Skuda and Miranda Nichols and others, it became clear that we monitor in more places for more contaminants more often. I spelled that all wrong. We monitor in more places more often for more contaminants with more protective standards in other states. And once I figured that out, I started comparing apples to apples and found out there aren't really apples to apples comparisons. For example, states vary in what their water quality standards are. So there was a freak out when 3 or 4 years ago when part of the Lower St. Croix was put on the impaired waters list around the Taylor's Falls area for phosphorus. And some reporter called Walter Mondale, who's been an advocate for the St. Croix River, and asked him what he thought. And I thought, why are they bothering him with this? And it turns out that Wisconsin's standard for phosphorus in that stretch is not as protective as we are. So Wisconsin says it's not impaired, and we say it is impaired because we're more protective. The tools available, we have generous dollars available because of the Clean Water Fund. We spend about 15% of the Clean Water Fund on the whole monitoring, characterization, and assessment, and in about 10 or 15 different programs. But what I just discovered is, more impairments doesn't mean that we're worse off. Some more examples here. Here we go. So I looked specifically at aquatic consumption and aquatic recreation using mercury and bacteria as the indicator. And it turns out, compared to Wisconsin, first of all, we have more waters than all of our neighbors, including Wisconsin to begin with, more stream miles and more lakes. But we assess more than 3 times more streams than Wisconsin does. Ergo, all other things being equal, we're going to have a higher number of impairments for mercury in streams. Our standard is also more protective for the lakes that Iowa does have. Sorry, I love Iowa. Second favorite state. I went to school there, but their water quality, when Iowa does test their lakes, they all have mercury in them, but they don't list them as being impaired. They just say we have general uh, protection or a fish consumption advice for all lakes. And so we don't need to put it on the impaired waters list, whereas we do. The greatest number of impairments we have in Minnesota are for mercury, more than 1,000. Iowa has virtually none. In Wisconsin, they do a little better. They will put something on the impaired waters list if the mercury level is above general fish consumption advice. So you can see the variation results in different numbers. On the bacteria side, turns out Wisconsin doesn't really assess streams for bacteria, only a few. We assess 2 to 15 times more stream miles than all of our neighbors. And we also have better quality streams among those streams that are assessed. I've learned that swimming in a stream in Iowa is not a very good idea because as a percentage, more than 50%, or they're 50% more likely to have impaired streams than we do. So the apples to apples comparison doesn't work very well. That doesn't mean that our impaired waters list doesn't bother us, but it shouldn't be used as a way to say that we're worse off than our neighbors. So we do apply the same logic for surface waters with drinking water. And I've found because we are kind of in our silos at times, state employees actually get the most value out of this kind of presentation because they can see what other agencies are doing. We have 920 plus communities that use groundwater for drinking water. This is the city of Verndale and Wadena County. It's bisected by Highway 10 here, and the gold line is the municipal boundary. The two wells, which are right along Highway 10, can be threatened by contaminants that are outside the municipal boundary, which you can see in the wellhead protection area. You see those blue lines extend south of the municipal boundary, and the municipality has less authority to create change with landowners, mostly farmers outside town. So enter the Clean Water Fund. The Department of Health uses the fund to work with the municipality to delineate not just the wellhead protection area, but the DWISMA, a drinking water supply management area, where other activities can happen. This is where a drinking water source protection plan gets put together, almost like a RAPS, except for drinking water sources. There might be a GRAPS, a groundwater restoration and protection studies, that's paired with the RAPS. But that plan that the health department puts together has a list, a to-do list, just like the RAPS, of things that have to happen to protect that drinking water source and get it to federal drinking water standards so that people can drink their water. Inside that, or the to-do list on the drinking water source protection plan, those half the items on that list can be funded by the Clean Water Fund, and they're usually grants for less than $10,000, very modest. But by 2034, we are pretty sure that we can protect for the indefinite period drinking water for groundwater. There's a similar process for surface waters for the 23 surface water systems in the state as well. And right now in the 2020s is when many of those plans are being put together and funded, which is great, all due to the Clean Water Fund. I did want to mention something about equity. That's something we've talked a lot about in the PCA. There are things that we do that we didn't necessarily think fit through an equity lens, but they do. And there's some things where we are trying to do things through an equity lens that maybe we hadn't thought about before. And this is just a smattering of some of the things we're doing. When I compare us to other states and you read things from the headlines about some water-related catastrophe, there's some things that don't affect us, or the risk of those catastrophes is lower in Minnesota, in part because of the Clean Water Fund, but also because of Minnesotans' commitment to the environment. One is that some of the protection activities that I mentioned that we do with the Clean Water Fund actually keep small town municipalities from having to pay exorbitant bills to have fresh and clean water. So people have more affordable bills to start with, which generally benefits people who are dealing with place-based and income-based inequities for water. We also have helped support a lot of rural communities that aren't incorporated, that have under-sewered or unsewered buildings. My old friend Bill Dunn worked on this stuff with the PCA. Not sure if he's listening. But the Public Facilities Authority works with the PCA to identify those communities and get small grants out so they can do some planning work on how to come up with a final fix for their sewage treatment problem. We have a new grant that we did set up for nonprofit organizations and tribal governments, the Water Legacy Partners Grant Program. The RFP closed on February 15th, but we're hoping to hear about some applications from organizations that we might not usually think of as one of the usual suspects in water quality that we'd like to work with to help them get more ideas into the pipeline to check off things that are in the wraps. We have the PCA in particular has been doing a lot of coordination with tribes, particularly in northern Minnesota, on surface water monitoring. I talked to someone with Bowser who's talked about working with the Red Lake Nation as well on some implementation projects. We've applied money from the Met Council in the city of St. Paul and neighborhoods that the Census Bureau calls areas of concentrated poverty. I'm not sure we'd use that phrase now, but that money is allowing for leak detection so that people aren't stuck with exorbitant bills in low-income neighborhoods because of faulty infrastructure. And PTA folks are very familiar with our low-income assistance to many rural residents for replacing septic systems. And then there's a really big deal we have on our recommendations for this year, which is to allow or to offer every private well owner in the state a free well test for 5 contaminants. We had tried and focus on 10% of well owners a year for 10 years, which happily happens before the expiration of the amendment. And we think that will empower people with the information they need to take steps to get fresh water or clean water that meets federal standards. I'm getting close to wrapping up here, but I wanted to mention some value that we provide with the Clean Water Fund. And I do this to remind people of how far we've come. I read this book by Judy Helgen, former retired research scientist with the PCA, called Peril in the Ponds, about investigating frog deformations. And I'm one of the people who was there at that time, who I spoke to the other day, said there were just 4 research scientists in the biological monitoring unit at the time. And so there was no capacity to even look for problems. They were just constantly responding to issues instead of getting a more comprehensive assessment. But there are things we can do with the Clean Water Fund that we couldn't do before, such as put together the TMDLs. We have more data now to allow for more precise permitting for something like a wastewater treatment plant, which has helped facilitate a credit trading. More credit trading wouldn't be really possible without accurate monitoring data. We also have more expertise. I'd argue we have more skilled professionals at all levels of government and in the private sector throughout Minnesota to be able to do complex projects to get more fishable, swimmable, and drinkable water, because the Clean Water Fund has funded that capacity. We also have been able to increase compliance for things like septic systems that we couldn't do before. And Dana Vanderbosch was very good at reminding me that we didn't even know how to identify waters of high quality just to know that we can protect them until we had the Clean Water Fund. We have this great graph from the Department of Agriculture showing how money from the lottery and the Clean Water Fund increased their ability to detect and analyze more pesticides than we had before. And people tell me that this is a respected lab in the US, and it's an asset that some places don't have. This also applies to the PCA. The Duluth office has worked in the St. Louis River area of concern in the Duluth Harbor and up to 20 miles upstream. We've also funded communities for sewage treatment in challenging geology alongside Voyageurs National Park. In these cases, these projects were able to be more shovel ready more quickly. That's how I put it in layperson's terms at the Capitol. We've been able to put dollars on the table with the Clean Water Fund as a match to be able to attract more federal money. That's been true for agriculture as well. We've attracted more money for direct aid to farmers for best management practices because of the Clean Water Fund. We're the largest contributor to the pot of money to be the state match for the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP, which is helping set aside a few tens of thousands of acres permanently in Minnesota in key watersheds. Overall, we're able to leverage more than $1 for every dollar of Clean Water Fund spending. It's actually $1.09 now, thanks to documentation by our outstanding agency staff. And now, finally, the recommendations for fiscal 24 and 25. The council makes recommendations every 2 years. We put out a big report. It's on our website, which is actually the PCA's website. And I have tried to highlight for people who are interested outside state government what we're trying to do that's new. We do have some more money than we did before, but we want to expand what we know that works and just do more of it. So, for example, we're giving several tens of millions of extra dollars to Bowser for that watershed-based implementation funding. So more green triangles in more watersheds. We're going to increase by 50% the money going to the Forever Green program, which has been developing and deploying perennials like intermediate wheatgrass, like Kernza, to help fix nitrogen in wellhead protection areas. More money for PCA for chloride reduction grants. So Brook will have more money to distribute for communities that are trying to reduce the amount of effluent they have from water softeners, as an example. More money for low-income grants to replace septic systems, also positive. DNR and Bowser will have some more money for water storage projects, and we're also trying to push more farmers to employ soil health practices, which helps do a bunch of things, including sequester carbon. Soil health is the paradigm we're all using for a variety of practices. And then finally, we also want to have additional capacity to assess threats to our waters. You may know, I'm sorry, I already mentioned the free well testing part, but we're also funding part of the things in the PFAS blueprint, such as permanent and regular monitoring of waters for PFAS. More capacity for the Department of Health to evaluate contaminants of emerging concern. And I know the PCA nominates many substances that they consider. DNR would get some money for freshwater mussel restoration, which actually can reduce nutrient flows in some cases. Improving culvert cost share dollars so that counties that are rebuilding roads and culverts can actually address those stressors that the RAPS has identified, like culverts that are in the wrong place. And then finally, something that Iowa and Iowa and Wisconsin have, but we don't have, which is a statewide website where people can go as a one-stop shop to see if their beach is open, that it might not be closed for bacteria. We do that with beaches on Lake Superior, but not anywhere else. And so after several tries, we're hopefully going to fund that, assuming that the legislature agrees. I do want to leave you with some big strategic questions that the council is pondering. We are in the process of revisiting our first strategic plan put together a couple of years ago. And sometimes there's no right answer here. As we have more money in the fund, we assume, what's the best use of that dollar? Do we beef up things that we have been doing? Do we pivot to new things? What's the best way to do it? Do we look at things that will get us $1 in value in payback or $10 in payback? Do we make some risky bets for things that will pay off 20 years from now, but we're not really sure? These are big questions we're thinking about. We do have some members who would say, should we really do much in southern Minnesota if agriculture isn't really going to change, when we could protect areas in northern Minnesota that are threatened with development, to make sure that we protect high quality waters? See if people want to shift dollars that way. I don't know that we could, but we're thinking about it. We're also asked by the legislature and others to look at new things. So microplastics is one thing. Dave Duffy's doing a great job investigating that, but the legislature said, hey, look at this. We're going to give you the money and take money away from something else that you're working on to look at this. And so we're trying to decide how much should we pivot to the new shiny things, as people call them, while we're still working on that 25-year plan. We've also talked about the idea of moving some spending out of the Clean Water Fund, not anything with the PCA, but there are things where we use bonding for stuff, easements, gray infrastructure, should we push for that to be in a bonding bill instead of the Clean Water Fund if we think the money is going to run out? And finally, we have discovered that some entities tend to look at the Clean Water Fund as being so reliable that maybe we put off asking for the harder thing. Um, Sometimes it's easier to fund something than it is to regulate it. As I'm sure you all know, there's always pushback to regulation. We also could ask for money from the general fund for things. If we don't get it this year, we're probably never going to get it because we have the surplus. But sometimes people use the Clean Water Fund as a backstop in case the general fund doesn't work out. And maybe that's not such a great idea. So those are big topics we're thinking about. This is a picture, Mark, you might recognize. This is in Arden Hills and Shoreview, Rice Creek. It's been restored partially with a Clean Water Fund grant. It was a stream, turned into a ditch, and now it's a stream again. And my family paddles down that every year. That's what the legacy amendment means to us in our family, and I suspect Minnesotans around the state also have examples where the legacy amendment has meant something to them as well. Mark, I'm going to stop there, and I'll be here as long as you like.
That was a great overview, Paul. Thanks for that talk. I think that photo that you're referring to there is Rice Creek up where it cuts across the what was the TCAP Superfund site, correct? That has been a real successful project up there.
Yeah, there are two. They've been restored in sections. One north of County Road I, going to Lexington, which is loopy, and then the middle section has been restored. And I think this is the middle section as you're getting close to 35W, over by the Mermaid, where you shoot through the culvert. Shoo!
Yeah. You know, I'm glad that you put that photograph in because it actually leads into the one of the things that I was going to segue into our questions and comments, and I don't know if you want to handle that, Katie, but just to get us off center on that, you know, one of the things that I see when I see that photograph of Rice Creek there is how long it took to implement that plan to actually study what was needed and to get it off the ground and to complete that construction. I mean, that was a long process and a very successful project, but it does make me think that the 25 years that we have the Clean Water Fund available to us, that is almost like, it seems to me like a bare minimum of time to be able to show the public what we're able to do when we have the time, money, and resources available to us to make those improvements.
Yeah, I've heard several state employees say it took 150 years to screw it up, and it's going to take more than 25 years to fix it.
Right.
And there
And
are
so
some cases
John,
where we have to have some expectations that some things are going to get a little better, but maybe not that much better. And so
right. And so John
knowing what we should
says,
expect is hard. So
you know, are you concerned with how to communicate success related to keeping waters from becoming impaired? Are you hearing about any success stories related to protection, kind of as a takeoff on some of that? How do we communicate with the public the success of this and not just the map of the red impaired
right.
waters that, you know, the freak out slide?
Right. So when I worked in recycling, I found that there are great ways to measure the success in reuse, recycling, composting, waste to energy, because money, people had to be paid to do things. And so that meant you were measuring things because you had to pay for them. But prevention, like the reduction part of reduce, reuse, recycle, is often hard to quantify because you don't know what you saved through prevention. And nobody made any money off of diverting materials that way except the waste generator. We have a similar issue with protection strategies. So if we invested in protection strategies and guaranteed high quality waters in certain part of the state indefinitely, that won't take anything off the impaired waters list because they weren't impaired to begin with. And so talking about how prevention pays is challenging, but at the same time, when people thought of the legacy amendment, I hear this from legislators a lot. They were thinking of kids jumping off the dock. There was an ad used for that. And so the protection strategies are something that you can say that will preserve this moment for you. The legacy amendment touches people emotionally. people are interested in data, but the protection strategies trigger a more emotional response. And that isn't something we're all necessarily trained to create. Um, and so we are experimenting a little bit with messaging on protection.
All right, looks like the next one's from Leah. I think I might be saying that right. Do you foresee there being plans to lobby to continue the Clean Water Fund? If so, what do you suggest are things we can do now to help demonstrate via maps/reports on its success?
Sure. Well, first, I would say there's some burden on the Clean Water Council to show that value. And so that falls to me, and we are actually putting together an interagency communication plan to try and show outcomes. Now, I should say, as a state employee, it isn't really for us to say, let's lobby for an electoral outcome, let's say, but it is, I think, okay to say, here's what we've done with the money, and here's what would not happen if the money ran out. Uh, Very helpful. There are advocates out there who push for the amendment in the nonprofit sector, particularly, who are starting to chatter a little bit about what they should be talking about. The money from the lottery runs out first, though. The Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund expires soon. I think it's next year. And so there's going to be legislation, well, there has been legislation introduced to renew the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And then after that, I suspect people will start talking about what they want to do with the legacy amendment. I've talked with some people who want to do that just to stay on the same page, but it's not for me to say, here's what you should do. But I suspect that those organizations will be asking us, where are we going? Where have we been? What can we show? I am pleased to say that a lot of the environmental groups that were very critical of us as a state have been more satiated in the last few years, because part of my job was to engage them and talk about what we're doing. And we've actually received a lot of kudos on the council from those groups for transparency and how we're making decisions and in giving voice to people who have concerns about particular things, or the drainage or sustainable agriculture. And so we're able to introduce in a public forum, a low key public forum on the council, ideas that people haven't heard before. So there's been an effort to engage those stakeholders who might be the people who advocate for the amendment. I'm not saying that's our grand strategy, but it's been helpful to have people see how we're using the money. I did hear criticisms from those groups saying, we think we're funding random acts of conservation. That was the phrase that they used. And I think when people see how we do use the money, as I just showed you, they'll go, okay, this isn't random. We actually have a plan, and we're spending money to figure out where to target so that we don't guess. There's nothing more expensive than guessing, whether you're doing home renovation or car repair or water quality. And I just think we can't underestimate the value of good data but we have to say why we're using the data. Some people think we're just collecting data just for kicks. And I just say, well, there's a reason we have this data, and that's why we do the RAPs and the GRAPs and the comprehensive plan and put it all together. So
Kind of similar question from Kristen, so there might be some overlap. Is there anything we staff can do to help summarize our work to communicate it? Who are the key folks we need to communicate this information to?
So Kathy Moore at the PCA and I have been scheming for some time to work with our agency colleagues on talking about the work products that come out with that interagency communication plan. So I can just say that every time I've asked agency staff for information to help facilitate that effort, everyone has been so gracious and helpful and has literally bent over backwards to get me information to help make the case for why we use the Clean Water Fund. So I would say keep doing what you're doing. And if I call somebody, that's usually the reason why. It's like trying to craft a message about a particular thing to show people doing. Just those the maps about, and the data about impairments. I mean, that took me a month of talking to half a dozen agency staff to understand how we're doing it, and then I would feed it back to them and saying, "Is this, if I say it this way, that somebody at the Capitol would understand? Is that accurate?" I'm always worried that I'm going to violate your scientific oath. That I don't want to say something that isn't true or dumb something down and simplify something without giving it appropriate context. So, and one thing that you can all do is make sure that I'm saying something accurately and not making an inference that isn't there. We always have to say, it depends, it means this and that. When I was at the legislature, I used to get frustrated with people who would not give a straight answer to things. And now that I'm in the state working with all of you, I'm like, oh, now I know why there isn't a straight answer here. But there are ways to interpret in ways that don't violate anyone's scientific training and doesn't dumb things down, but is a way to get in the door so that you can bring them into a bigger conversation about the science.
And we've got a question from Sarah Fossen Johnson. It says, "Hi, Paul. My unit at MDH is responsible for developing the health-based guidance for CECs. One of the things I've really enjoyed in the past was the ability to go to the CWC and talk about our work from the staff perspective. Is there any plan to give input on the strategic plans of the CWC from the perspective of the scientists doing the work? We have a lot of great information that might help inform the big decisions the CWC is facing."
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for your work, Sarah. I believe you're working on the PFAS and the CECs, right? I remember sitting in on one of the first meetings for this Contaminants of Emergency Concern program when I was still a legislator. And I just was like, whew, this is over my head. My wife is a chemist by training, so she could understand it, but it was a lot. And to see the capacity that we're able to give to this issue that other states cut on is amazing. We're actually going to increase funding for that program significantly in fiscal 24 and 25. So we do have agency staff on the council. Get to know them. At the PCA, it's Glenn Skuda. Tanny Eschenauer is at Health. All of them are very good at injecting expertise and then phoning a friend when they need to get information, such as you, Sarah, to make sure that we aren't talking at our rear end. So I would strongly suggest you talk to your Clean Water Council rep. Those are the people who have really bent over backwards, and they're the first people I talk to if we need to get some information so that we can find the right person. We definitely are going to get agency feedback on a strategic plan. We're taking a whole year. I mean, it's not going to be a one and done thing. So we're going to move very, very methodically. Having agency expertise to tell us what we can actually do is going to be critical. So it's easy with the RAPs, like, well, all RAPs will be done by 2023, check. But will every community affected by the groundwater protection rule meet federal? Never have any community that has too much nitrate in their well as a result of our work? Well, we don't know. We have to kind of take what the environment gives us.
Dan Fettig, could the process to reinstate the legacy amendment be started earlier than the last election cycle, that it is possible?
It's certainly possible. I mean, the legislature this year even could say, let's renew it or get rid of the expiration altogether. I mean, if they really wanted to and put it on the ballot. So that's possible. My thought is there's going to be an election in 2028 for the Senate, who will decide who's still in the Senate for a couple of years. And so I think people may read the tea leaves at that point. It does take a while for people to organize, raise money if they're going to do it from the outside and do ads and that sort of thing. So there are conversations out there outside state government where people are just starting to float what happens then. That's why I put those deadlines on there, like 11 years, 4 months, 29 days, because it's never too early to think about it.
And that's the last question we have in the chat. If anybody has a question and they want to unmute, go ahead. Otherwise, if you drop it in the chat, I will read it for you. Or if nobody
Well, I have
has
one.
anything
I
else,
have
then
one,
we can
Paul.
wrap up.
I have one for Paul. You know, here we are, a lot of the people listening in here, of course, Paul, are of the scientific bent, and, you know, we grind away on things day after day, week after week, month after month, you know, and make use of the funds. I'm kind of curious, and you might have kind of alluded to some of this already. What do you think is the biggest challenge you had from your perspective in um, communicating or showing the kind of work that we're doing to the public or to the legislature that, you know, they're not engaged with this on a daily basis.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's something that, you know, they have to look at once in a while and say, well, I don't know, is this worth it or not? Or,
Right.
you know, how do we look at this? What is your sense is the biggest challenge that way that you see, you know, that we should be kind of thinking about?
Well, so here's the statistic that floored me that Dave Wallace shared with me in one report, and that 85% of our impairments are from non-point sources. And I talk a lot of my community. You know, once you talk to a Rotary, then suddenly everyone wants to invite you to everyone's a member of something. So I get to test messages out on a lot of people. And people are just flummoxed by this. 85% of our water pollution is non-points. Wow, I didn't have no idea. People have the impression from the headlines that we're dealing with, you know, the Cuyahoga River on fire in 1970. You know, that or they look at the impaired waters map and think that's all molten lava that's going to catch on fire and kill us all. Well, okay, you can swim in an impaired stream for phosphorus. It just is going to be, the water quality isn't going to be as good, and you may find an area that's impaired for aquatic recreation, but there's some fish in it, and it doesn't mean that everything is biologically dead. So getting people to see the expectations of what we're trying to do is a little different. There isn't the idea, mostly based on headlines in other places, Flint, Michigan, Houston, Texas, California, Nevada, Arizona, and people just say, well, could this happen here? And it turns out that the risk of a lot of those disasters is lower because of A, competent governments, B, we have money to do things, and we just have better handle. It doesn't mean that there isn't any risk of anything, but I would say that the hardest thing to explain is that some things take time, and in areas where regulation does not apply or apply well, the work is slow, and you have to spend money to persuade people to do something. Now, like with smart salting, that's easy. You can go to Public Works Department and it's not easy, but it's easier. You'd say, do you want to save 40% on your salt costs and reduce the pollution of your lakes? Oh, sure. But here's a free training that you can go for, and it's been wildly successful with thousands of people going through that. A lot of hard work. I don't want to imply that it's easy. But trying to work in agriculture, for example, is really hard. One of the biggest threats to water quality is peer pressure in communities. I grew up in the East Coast and was introduced to this when we read Main Street, about the fictional Minnesota town of Gopher Prairie, where everybody kind of knows your business and you don't want to do anything that's out of step with your neighbors. And that has been a big barrier to people trying things like no-till agriculture and cover crops. And I've heard this at field days where people had said, oh, Grandpa said, what will the neighbors think? And so we're actually investing not in science for that, but to hold people's hands to let them know that it's okay. Someone will be there all of the way if you want to try something different and to take a risk. And chances are you will actually make more money and have a more resilient farm as a result of using soil health practices and no-till agriculture. But we invest a lot of money in expertise. And so I've emphasized that a lot in our report on our recommendations, and listed the areas of all the expertise. From, we have an irrigation extension agent that ag is paying for, and field days galore, nitrogen communication about reducing nitrogen. Bowser's doing soil health grants and working with several county SWCDs on showing people soil health practices and things that protect drinking water so that there's someplace locally that farmers can go to see that something works. We have the same problem, of course, in our cities and in the suburbs. I mean, Mark, you're from Shoreview. There are a lot of homes now that have in-ground sprinkler systems. We're draining our water tower, so it's not just a groundwater depletion issue by using too much water for no good reason. The fire department is worried about it because we're draining our water tower faster than we can fill it. I have a cascading rain garden and some low maintenance turf, but all my neighbors are pranking away with chemicals and everything on their lawn and using salt and everything. So we all have our work cut out for us, but it's that persuasion part. We're not going to send the NPCA out to police my lawn and look at every farm. There are 58,000 of them. I mean, we have 1,200 feedlots, and it's hard enough just to inspect those. So making it clear to the public that part is hard, the persuasion part when regulation may not work or there's a pushback is probably the biggest challenge. Sorry, that was a long answer and I've gone over time.
No, that's okay. That was great. Let's see, we don't have any other questions, so it's 10:01. I think we can probably wrap
Great.
things up. Thank you so much for your time, Paul. This was a wonderful
My
talk.
pleasure. It's the highlight of my week, I can tell you.
Well, it's certainly the highlight of ours. Thanks so much, Paul, for the talk.
Great. Stay safe, everybody out there. Don't lift with your legs. You shovel. All right. Well, thank you,
Yeah.
everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks again, Paul.
See you, Paul. Thank